1611. A Hungarian courtroom. A witness is testifying. A former castle servant. Trembling as she speaks. The countess summoned me. There was a girl in the dungeon. Maybe 12 years old. The countess cut off her hands. Finger by finger. The child was screaming. The countess was laughing. Then she had the blood collected in a bowl and smeared it on her face. She believed it made her younger. According to court records, Elizabeth Bathory killed 650 young girls. Some by torture, some by starvation, some by freezing. The youngest victim was 9 years old. The oldest was 26. But most were between 10 and 16. Because that age provided the freshest blood. And the countess bathed in their blood. Every day. For youth. For beauty. For 25 years. History's most prolific female serial killer. After a 4-year trial, she was convicted. But not executed. Because she was nobility. Instead, she was walled up alive in her own castle. In a small room. No windows. No door. Just a small slot for food. She lived there for 4 years. Then she died. But her victims, those 650 girls, they never got justice. Tonight, I'll tell you their story. Before diving into one of history's most documented cases of systematic murder and one woman's descent into what can only be described as sadistic madness, if you're interested in the dark truths that history tried to hide, consider hitting that like button and subscribing. And comment below to let me know where you're listening from. These stories need to be told, and the victims need to be remembered. Elizabeth Bathory was born on August 7, 1560, into one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in Hungary. The Bathory family owned vast estates, commanded private armies, and were related to kings and princes throughout Central Europe. Elizabeth's uncle was the King of Poland. Her cousin was the Prime Minister of Hungary. This wasn't just wealth and power. This was the kind of aristocratic status where you were essentially above the law. From childhood, Elizabeth was educated far beyond what was typical for women of her era. She was fluent in Hungarian, Latin, and German. She studied literature, music, and administration. By all accounts, she was intelligent, beautiful, and charismatic. In 1575, at age 15, she married Count Ferenc Nadasdy, himself from powerful nobility. The marriage united two of Hungary's most influential families. For the first years of her marriage, there's no evidence of unusual cruelty. Elizabeth managed the family estates efficiently while Ferenc was away fighting in wars against the Ottoman Empire. She had 4 children who survived infancy. By aristocratic standards of the time, she was a successful wife and mother. But something was changing beneath the surface. Ferenc died in 1604, leaving Elizabeth as a widow at age 44. With her husband gone, she had complete control over vast estates and hundreds of servants. And it was around this time that the rumors began. Young servant girls were disappearing. Bodies were being found in unusual places. And those who worked closest to the countess began whispering about things happening in the castle dungeons. What exactly was happening? The truth, as revealed in the trial records from 1611, is almost too horrifying to comprehend. Elizabeth Bathory, with the help of several accomplices, was torturing and murdering young girls on a scale that seems impossible for one person to achieve. But the evidence is overwhelming and comes from multiple independent sources. Testimonies from over 300 witnesses, physical evidence found in her castles, and even some of her own letters. Let's be clear about what the historical record shows. This isn't legend or exaggeration. The trial records are preserved in Hungarian archives and have been examined by historians for centuries. What follows is based on documented testimony given under oath, corroborated by multiple witnesses, and supported by physical evidence. Elizabeth and her accomplices would recruit young girls, typically between ages 10 and 16, under the pretense of offering them employment or education at the castle. The girls were usually from poor families who saw this as an opportunity for their daughters. They had no idea they were sending their children to their deaths. Once at the castle, the girls would initially work as normal servants. But then, one by one, they would be taken to the dungeons. What happened there was documented in horrifying detail by witnesses who participated or observed. The testimony is consistent across dozens of witnesses, suggesting these weren't isolated incidents but systematic practices that occurred regularly over many years. The torture methods were varied and inventive in their cruelty. Some victims were beaten for hours with clubs or whips. Others had needles driven under their fingernails or into their lips. Some were burned with hot irons or had their flesh cut with scissors or knives. In winter, girls would be stripped naked and doused with water, then left outside to freeze to death slowly. One witness, a castle servant named Susanna, testified, "I saw the countess push needles under the fingernails of a girl who had done nothing wrong. The girl screamed and begged, but the countess laughed and pushed the needles deeper. Then she cut the girl's hands with scissors, making many small cuts, and collected the blood in a basin." Another witness, one of Elizabeth's accomplices who testified in exchange for mercy, described what she called the draining. "When the countess wanted to bathe, we would prepare a girl. We would cut her in specific places where the blood would flow freely but death would be slow. The arms, the legs, sometimes the throat, but not deep enough to kill quickly. The girl would be suspended over the bath, and the countess would sit below as the blood dripped down onto her. This is where the legend of Elizabeth Bathory, bathing in blood, comes from. It wasn't figurative. According to multiple testimonies, she literally bathed in the blood of her victims, believing it would preserve her youth and beauty. She would smear blood on her face like a cosmetic, drink small amounts of it, and bathe in tubs while girls bled out above her. The age of the victims is particularly disturbing. While some were young women in their late teens or 20s, many were children. The youngest confirmed victim was 9 years old. At that age, they wouldn't have understood what was happening until it was too late. One witness described a 10-year-old girl crying for her mother while being tortured, and Elizabeth mocking her cries. How did this continue for so long? Elizabeth's status as nobility created a shield that protected her for years. When bodies were discovered, local authorities were reluctant to investigate someone so powerful. When servants fled and told stories, they were dismissed as lying about their betters. When girls disappeared, their poor families had no resources to demand investigation. But by 1610, the scale had become impossible to hide. Bodies were being buried hastily in gardens and fields around Elizabeth's various castles. Some weren't buried at all. The smell was attracting attention, and servants who had fled were telling consistent stories that couldn't be ignored. The final catalyst was a mistake. In December 1610, Elizabeth and her accomplices killed several girls at once and didn't have time to dispose of the bodies properly. For bodies were thrown over the castle wall, visible to villagers below. This blatant disregard for secrecy finally forced the authorities to act. On December 30th, 1610, Palatine Georgi Thurzo, the highest-ranking official in Hungary after the king, led a raid on Čachtice Castle, Elizabeth's primary residence. What they found confirmed the worst rumors. In the dungeons, they discovered one girl who was still alive but had been so severely tortured that she died within hours. 2 bodies that were still warm, killed within the last few hours. Evidence of many more victims. Blood-stained walls, torture implements, basins encrusted with dried blood. In the days following, they searched Elizabeth's other properties and interviewed hundreds of witnesses. The testimony was remarkably consistent. Girl after girl had been tortured and killed. The bodies had been buried in gardens, burned in furnaces, thrown in rivers, or fed to dogs. The estimated number of victims, based on witness accounts and physical evidence, was approximately 650 girls over a period of roughly 25 years. Let me emphasize, 650 is not a confirmed count. It's an estimate based on testimony. Some historians argue the number was lower, perhaps 200 to 300. Others suggest it could have been higher, as not all victims may have been reported or discovered. But even at the most conservative estimates, we're talking about one of history's most prolific serial killers, regardless of gender. The trial began in January 1611. Elizabeth herself was never formally tried. Her noble status protected her from appearing in court. But her 4 main accomplices were tried, and their testimonies provided most of the evidence against her. The accomplices were Dorothea, known as Dorka, Elizabeth's chief aide; Ilona Joe, a wet nurse who had worked for the family for years; Katalin Benecki, a washerwoman; Janos Ujeri, a manservant. These four had helped Elizabeth acquire victims, participated in the torture, and disposed of bodies. Their testimony, given under both normal questioning and torture, standard practice in that era, was detailed and consistent. They described specific victims, specific methods of torture, and specific locations where bodies were hidden. Over 300 witnesses testified. Many were servants who had seen or heard things but had been too afraid to speak. Others were villagers who had noticed girls disappearing. Some were parents looking for daughters who had gone to work at the castle and never returned. The testimonies paint a picture of systematic horror. This wasn't impulsive violence. It was calculated, organized, and sustained over decades. Elizabeth kept a registry of her victims, though this was never found. It was allegedly destroyed before the raid. She had specific rooms in her castles designated for torture. She had accomplices whose job was specifically to acquire new victims. One particularly disturbing aspect was how the torture evolved over time. Early victims seemed to have been killed relatively quickly. But as years passed, the torture became more prolonged and elaborate, as if Elizabeth was developing and refining her methods, experimenting with ways to maximize suffering and prolong death. Why did she do it? The trial focused primarily on the bloodbathing for youth and beauty, and this became the popular narrative, the vain countess murdering girls to stay young. But modern psychological analysis suggests something more complex was at work. Elizabeth likely suffered from what we would now recognize as sadistic personality disorder combined with elements of psychopathy. The bloodbathing may have been a rationalization, a way to justify behavior that she was compelled to do for other reasons. The pleasure she reportedly took in the torture itself suggests that causing suffering was its own reward. Some historians have noted that Elizabeth experienced significant trauma and witnessed violence in her childhood. Her family was known for cruelty, and some relatives showed signs of mental illness. She may have been exposed to violence against servants from a young age, normalizing it. Her husband Ferenc was reportedly cruel and may have introduced her to torture as entertainment during his time home from wars. But understanding potential causes doesn't excuse the actions. Elizabeth Bathory made choices, repeatedly over 25 years, to torture and murder young girls. She had education, intelligence, and resources. She could have chosen differently. Instead, she chose to cause unimaginable suffering to hundreds of children. The sentence for her accomplices was severe. Dorothea and Ilona Joe, being the primary participants, were sentenced to have their fingers torn out with red-hot pincers, since those fingers had pulled the girls to their deaths, then to be burned alive. Katalin Benecki, being slightly less involved, was beheaded before burning. Janos Ujeri, being the youngest and least involved, was beheaded without burning. These sentences were carried out publicly in January 1611, at Bathe. The executions were meant to send a message that even those who served nobility would face justice for such crimes. The crowd reportedly numbered in the thousands. People came from across the region to see justice delivered for the murdered girls. But Elizabeth herself escaped execution. Her family's power and influence meant that putting a Bathory on trial and executing her would have been politically explosive. It might have sparked conflicts between noble families or even civil war. So a compromise was reached. Elizabeth would be punished, but privately. She was walled up in a set of rooms in Čachtice Castle. This wasn't simple imprisonment. The windows and door were sealed with brick and mortar. Only small slots were left for food and waste removal. She was essentially buried alive in her own home, with just enough space to move around a single room. Elizabeth Bathory lived in these sealed rooms for 4 years. She had no visitors, no conversation, no view of the outside world. Just darkness, silence, and the company of her own thoughts. On August 21, 1614, she died. She was 54 years old. A guard, looking through the food slot, found her lying face down on the floor. She had been dead for several days. Her body was initially buried in the church at Cactus, but local people protested so strongly they didn't want a monster buried in consecrated ground that it was moved to the Bathory family crypt elsewhere. Even in death, she was unwelcome. But what about the victims? The 650 girls whose lives were stolen? Most remain nameless. The trial focused on Elizabeth and her accomplices, not on identifying or honoring the victims. They were mostly peasant girls, poor, with families who had no power or influence. Their names weren't recorded. Their lives weren't documented. They exist in history only as numbers in testimony. We know a few details about some victims. One was named Pola, described as a pretty girl of about 12, who was tortured because she had beautiful hands that Elizabeth was jealous of. Another was named Dorixa, 10 years old, daughter of a washerwoman, who was killed in winter by being doused with water and frozen. A third was named Ilona Balog, 14, who tried to escape and was caught and tortured for 3 days as punishment before dying. But these are exceptions. Most victims remain completely anonymous. They were considered unimportant by their society. Peasant girls whose lives didn't matter to anyone except their families. The historical record preserves the name of their killer but not their own names. This erasure compounds the injustice of their murders. Let's think about what these girls experienced. Imagine being 12 years old, from a poor family, offered a position at a great castle. It seems like incredible luck, an opportunity for a better life. You say goodbye to your family, perhaps for what you expect will be months or years, excited about your future. At first, the castle is amazing, larger and grander than anywhere you've ever been. The work is hard but no worse than what you do at home. Then one day, you're told the Countess wants to see you. You're nervous but also excited. The great lady herself is taking notice of you. You're taken to the dungeons. You don't understand why until you see the bloodstains on the walls. Then you understand. You try to run, but there are guards. You scream, but no one comes to help. And then the torture begins. How long did it last for each victim? Some died within hours. Others were kept alive for days or even weeks, tortured repeatedly. Imagine being 12 years old, in agony, knowing you're going to die, crying for your mother who doesn't even know where you are. Imagine understanding that the person hurting you is enjoying it, that your suffering is entertainment for her. This is what happened to 650 girls. Each one experienced their own individual nightmare. Each one died in terror and pain. And most were children, not adults who might at least understand what was happening, but children who couldn't comprehend why someone would hurt them this way. The psychological impact on survivors, the servants who witnessed these horrors but weren't killed, must have been devastating. Many testified at the trial, describing what they saw in detail that still horrifies 400 years later. They lived the rest of their lives knowing they had witnessed ultimate evil and been unable to stop it. Some historians have questioned whether the accusations against Elizabeth Bathory were exaggerated or even fabricated. They point out that she was a wealthy woman with enemies, that her estates were valuable, and that powerful men might have had motives to bring her down. Could this have been a conspiracy to destroy her and seize her property? The evidence argues strongly against this theory. The testimony was too consistent, too detailed, and came from too many independent sources. The physical evidence, the bodies, the blood-stained dungeons, the torture implements, confirmed the testimonies. And Elizabeth herself never denied the accusations. She was given opportunities to defend herself through representatives, but she never claimed innocence. Her silence suggests guilt. Some defenders argue that 650 is an impossible number. How could one woman kill that many people over 25 years without being stopped? But the math actually works out. 650 victims over 25 years is about 26 per year, roughly 2 per month. For someone with unlimited resources, private estates, and complete control over hundreds of servants, this was absolutely possible. Moreover, serial killers often accelerate over time. Elizabeth probably started slowly, with 1 or 2 victims per year in the 1580s, then increased gradually as she became more confident and more addicted to the violence. By the end, in 1609 to 1610, multiple witnesses describe killings happening almost weekly. The Elizabeth Bathory case reveals something important about how serial killers can operate when they have wealth and power. Most serial killers we study today are caught relatively quickly because they lack resources to hide their crimes effectively. They leave evidence. They have to dispose of bodies in ways that get discovered. They interact with victims in ways that create witnesses. But Elizabeth had none of these limitations. She owned vast estates where she could hide bodies. She controlled everyone around her through wealth and threats. Her victims were girls whose families had no power to demand investigation. Her status as nobility made authorities reluctant to act even when evidence emerged. This combination of factors allowed her to operate for decades. This raises disturbing questions about how many other historical figures might have been serial killers who were never caught or punished. How many nobles, kings, emperors, or other powerful individuals throughout history committed similar crimes but were protected by their status? We'll never know because the evidence was suppressed or destroyed. What we do know is that Elizabeth Bathory represents an extreme case of what happens when someone with sadistic tendencies has unlimited power over vulnerable people. The torture and murder of 650 girls wasn't an inevitable result of her psychology. It was made possible by a social system that treated peasant girls as disposable and protected nobility from consequences. If Elizabeth had been born a peasant, she might have become a killer, but she would have been caught after one or two victims. If she had been born in a society with stronger rule of law that applied to everyone, her crimes would have been stopped much sooner. The intersection of her psychology and her social position created conditions where mass murder was possible. The victims deserve better than to be remembered only as numbers in the legend of the Blood Countess. Each was an individual with hopes, fears, family, friends. Each wanted to live. Each had their life stolen by someone who treated them as raw material for sadistic pleasure disguised as beauty treatment. The 9-year-old girl, the youngest victim, what was her name? What did she dream about? Did she have siblings? We don't know. History didn't think her name was worth recording. But she mattered. She was a child whose life had value, whose death was a tragedy, whose suffering deserves to be acknowledged even if we can't know the details. This is why we tell these stories. Not to glorify killers like Elizabeth Bathory, not to wallow in horror for entertainment, but to remember victims that history tried to forget. The peasant girls of 16th century Hungary didn't matter to their society's power structure, but they mattered to their families. And they should matter to us. Every statistic is a person. Every number in testimony is a life stolen. When we say 650 victims, we're talking about 650 individual human beings who experienced fear and pain and death at the hands of someone who should have protected them but instead destroyed them. Elizabeth Bathory died in 1614, walled up in darkness. Her victims died years earlier, in dungeons, in torture chambers, crying for help that never came. Justice, such as it was, came too late for them. But their memory can still be honored. Their suffering can still be acknowledged. And the lessons of their murders, about power, about cruelty, about systems that protect the powerful while sacrificing the vulnerable, remain relevant today. Remember the Blood Countess, yes, but remember more importantly the 650 girls whose blood she shed. Remember that they were children. Remember that they mattered. And remember that preventing such horrors requires eternal vigilance against power without accountability and cruelty